Right. Moving swiftly on, the next item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 94954 in the name of Jim Hume on Keep Justice Local. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I invite those members who wish to take part in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. Mr Hume, if you are ready, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I speak on behalf of many constituents when I say that there are genuine fears for how local justice will be dispensed across South Scotland as a result of Scottish Government closure orders last June. We've had members' debates on this before. In 2002, of course, Christine Graham brought a debate forward on Peebles Court, and I'll give you some quotes on that. The issue concerns how we bring democracy home to people and down to the roots. The fundamental tenet of any democratic society is a judicial system that's not only affordable but is accessible and visible. And also, fundamentally, the issue concerns how a democratic society works. Sheriff courts are part of the apparatus of state at the local level. Not my words, but the very words of Kenny MacAskill himself. What has happened to him in the last decade? Under his administration, we have had courts in Annan, Kirkcudbright closed. Courts in Duns, Peebles and Haddington will close. And despite MacAskill's warm words over a decade ago, the Scottish Government last June exhibited its typically instinctive lean towards centralisation. Haddington business will transfer to Edinburgh, with fears that courts in Edinburgh will struggle to deal with the extra caseloads. Figures released by the Court Service at the end of last year show already that, and I quote again, cases being heard at Edinburgh Sheriff Court have increased by 42%. Summary cases outstanding had risen by 49%, and the time taken to bring a case to court had increased by 2 weeks. Cases being heard at the Justice of the Peace Court have increased by 50%. Summary cases outstanding had increased by 139%, and the time taken to bring cases to court had increased by 17 weeks. These are really worrying figures. The public are rightly questioning the decision to close a busy Haddington court, serving a large East Lothian county on the basis of proximity to other facilities. The inevitable delays will damage public confidence in local justice, will create a less efficient system and cause stress for victims and witnesses. The Law Society of Scotland has been warning of exactly this scenario, and the rest of South of Scotland, Kirkcudbright, has lost its Sheriff Court after 550 years. Annan, its Justice of the Peace Court, with its 700-year history. The mass transfer of business to Dumfries represents a huge geographical area. The closure of all 5 of these courts present huge travel issues. That's the view of the councils, professionals and individuals alike. The Law Society of Scotland stated that these closures seriously threaten access to justice in many parts of Scotland and could lead to a long-term decline in our justice system. The changes will force many court users to travel further distances at greater expense, and with the result that access to justice is limited, particularly for vulnerable people and those living in rural communities. Concerns echoed by East Lothian Council, Dumfries and Galloway Council and Scottish Borders Council. The Law Society and others say that removing courts will result in non-reporting of crime because people won't want to get involved in the hassle of attending court due to the cost and the long journeys. And it's been underlined that removing courts could harm the rehabilitation of offenders who see the impact of their crime on their local community. Worrying concerns expressed by non-political professionals and legal experts. In the Borders, we have to await the outcome of the feasibility studies group's views on what any future options could look like, including the option of a justice centre. The decision to close Duns and Peebles courts was, I think, a starter for 10, and my fear is that the work of the study group is a fait accompli with the closure of Jedburgh and Selkirk, a done deal. Selkirk, the very place that our nation's hero, Sir Walter Scott, was sheriff of for over 20 years. Indeed, members of that study group admit that the closure of Duns and Peebles will create a situation where come 2015, court provision will be untenable because access to justice will have been compromised. There's been no information on what shape a justice centre would or could take, how it could work, or what other services may or may not be incorporated from elsewhere. In essence, we're looking at fundamental changes to our justice system in the borders at the same time as being a guinea pig for a notion of a justice centre. Those same constituents who have contacted me about their fears for access to justice have also talked about their local concerns regarding their towns being raided of yet another key facility, hot on the heels of police counters and control rooms being closed. It's a dangerous precedent to remove high-value civil service jobs from rural areas. Every single job in our rural South Scotland is at a premium, even if the numbers are small. But more than that, as Kenny MacAskill himself said in 2002, not only does the court's presence give the town a gravitas that would be denigrated if the court were removed, but the court provides the area with a symbol of justice in a democratic society. MacAskill's words. Deputy Presiding Officer, I've been frustrated at what I see as a lack of government accountability on this issue. Answers to my parliamentary questions have insisted that responsibility for Scotland's courts is not a matter for Scottish ministers, but the Scottish Court Service says different. They state, any recommendations made within this report, this is regarding their consultation recommendations, relative to closure of sheriff courts or closure of disestablishment of justice of the peace courts, are matters that fall within the responsibility of Scottish ministers, this government's responsibility. Also, they go on to state, where we recommend court closures, it will be for Scottish ministers to consider and to take any necessary statutory orders to the Scottish Parliament. That's this government's responsibility. They also state, we will therefore submit our recommendations for consideration by Scottish ministers. It will then be for Scottish ministers to reach a view on what orders they intend laying. This government's responsibility. And that's, unfortunately, been borne out by the Scottish Government closure orders last June, all in the power of the Justice Secretary, all in the power of this Government to reject further court closures. I look to the Cabinet Secretary and his ministers for assurances that they will reject any future recommendations to close Selkirk and Jedburgh Sheriff Courts.
Thanks very much. Now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Christine Graham.
Presiding Officer, I'm grateful to Jim Hume for ensuring that today's debate could take place and that raises many important issues for those who live in the south of Scotland. I'm also grateful to him for the statistics that he's played out for us today, and it saves me a great deal of time in repeating these statistics. There is no doubt that the outcome from this government's policy is to starve justice in the round. And what we now begin to perceive is an emaciated system which, across the board, is being cut, is being reduced, and is suffering the kinds of outcomes that can only result in communities feeling that justice is not local, is not being delivered effectively, and does not serve the purposes of our communities, the very purpose for which justice is provided. The closures of Duns, Haddington, Kirkcudbright and Peebles were in themselves a great disappointment to many members across this chamber, no matter the party that they represent. The threat that's still perceived as far as Jedburgh and Selkirk Sheriff Courts are concerned are threats which are felt very strongly by those communities, and the notion of hubs which have been played out in this chamber and would seem at one point almost to be hubbing around the country as each area was promised a consideration of a hub, only further confused this matter, in not only my mind, but in the minds of communities across the south of Scotland. Taken together with the closure of public counters at police level, the perception that local policing is not delivered in a way that communities see as valuable, there is a worrying future ahead for the delivery of justice. If witnesses are to come forward, they need to have a confidence that there is a system there to support the evidence that they are prepared to provide on all of our behalves. I'm happy to.
I'm grateful to him. The member is himself experienced in the field of justice in his previous career, but I wonder if he can explain to me whether the changes, the closures that have been mentioned, the extra travel times, the extra costs, the extra expenses, what likely impact is that going to have on people's willingness to come forward and engage themselves in the justice system?
Graham Pearson.
Presiding Officer, I think that it's common sense to realise that where witnesses will suffer the inconvenience of further travel, where there is a possibility if they rely on public transport, they are likely to be in the company of those that they may well be giving evidence against or their relatives, where distances have to be covered, and very often by witnesses who already suffer some incapacity. That's a disincentive to coming forward. In addition, we are aware of the legal aid cuts that have taken place elsewhere, which affect working people who will be obliged, if their income, their disposable income is of sufficient level, will be obliged to pay in order to be represented at the court, and where that court is some distance away from their location and their communities. It does not augur well for the future, and it would be very difficult to say that this is progressive policy in action. It's been driven by budget cuts. It's been insisted on by the Cabinet Secretary, who has delivered, without doubt, a system which suffers a hunger, a need for investment, and looks an emaciated shadow of its former self. I regret that, and I hope that the Minister is able to give us some words of comfort for the future and some commitment. Thanks, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call on Christine Graham to be followed by John Lamont.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful to Jim Hume for bringing this debate to the Chamber and reminding me of what I said in 2002. But we're not in 2002 when money was sloshing about this Parliament and a Labour-Liberal coalition. We're in 2014 when there have been huge cuts to this government's budget. So let's start by being honest. Why did the closure of Sheriff Courts come up in the first place? It came up because of those swathing cuts to the Scottish budget, both revenue and capital. I quote from the Cabinet Secretary, the SCS, this is to the committee in June last year, because I followed this. I'm not just in a debate. I know the detail of this. The SCS is therefore seeking to save £4.5 million from its revenue budget. It estimates that the proposal will save almost £1 million per annum and an estimated maintenance backlog of £3 million. And I emphasise backlog because you have to call the Liberal Democrats were in office here for 8 years in coalition with Labour, and even the Minister then was Jim Wallace, now Lord Wallace of Tankerness. That seems to be the ultimate destination of the Liberal Democrats. I've listened to enough guff. Why are we short of cash here? I've explained. And who cut it here? Why Danny Alexander, Liberal Democrat, First Secretary to the Tory Treasury. So hypocrisy from Better Together
Mr. Hume, the member's not taking
around the Chamber here. We've only got 4 minutes, you had 7. And I quote again from the Justice Committee, and it isn't the Cabinet Secretary, this is Lord Gill, Lord President of the Court of Session, Senior Judge in Scotland, quote, whether it likes it or not, the Scottish Court Service must achieve a reduction in its budget of 20% over the 4-year period from 2011 to 2014-15. At the moment, 40% of our running costs are tied up in buildings that form the court estate and very considerable costs of their upkeep and maintenance. And Lord Gill went on. The impetus for all this work arose from the end to save money, but he went on to say, I quote, my feeling is that a perfectly good intellectual case could be made for these changes even if we were not living in these rather unusual economic circumstances. And times have changed. Courts in my patch of the Borders landed where they are because that's where the farms, the estates, the horses and carts and markets were. Now we have Galashiels with the new transport hub under development for buses and trains. We have Asda, Walmart, Tesco's Extra. These are today's market squares. So that's why it makes sense to locate a justice centre in Galashiels. And I am kept informed into progress. The last meeting was the 21st of March 2014, where the SCS, Scottish Court Service, much maligned by some in here, but they're the people in charge, met Scottish Borders Council, engaged with victim support, Women's Aid, Children First, local solicitors, the Community Justice Authority and others. I call that wide consultation, and they seem very satisfied with doing that, and it will report early in the summer. That does not preclude the sittings of courts elsewhere, as we in the Justice Committee know, because a court can be designated to a child welfare hearing which is more suitable to the witness. So I say gently to Jim Hume, the savage cuts from his team at Westminster have not led to cutting legal aid to those, say, wanting contact with their children, as it has done in England. So if Jim Hume wants to keep those courts open, he has to say where the money is coming from. Maybe we'd have the buildings, but nobody would have legal aid to cross the threshold. So the whiff of hypocrisy, which is why I'm so angry at this, the false fury from those benches, Labour who got us in the mess in the first place, the Liberal Democrats and the Tories who've made cuts to our budgets, and then they say, why are we doing this? Because you've cut the money, and the choices that have been made by the Cabinet Secretary are good choices. Legal aid, not buildings.
Thanks very much. I call on John Lamont to be followed by Dr Elaine Murray.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate and the opportunity today to stand up for local justice in the Borders, apparently unlike the other Borders MSP. I completely agree with the tenor and content of the motion in the name of Jim Hume, except I would point out that while court closures were a recommendation of the Scottish Court Service, the decision was very much made by the Justice Committee, and the decision to close Sheriff Courts in Duns, Haddington, Kirkcudbright and Peebles was forced through by the SNP members on that committee. I was proud to vote against this proposal. Despite not being the busiest of courts, Duns, in my constituency, hears over 330 Sheriff Court cases a year, with the JP Court sitting fortnightly, and I'm in no doubt this was an important local service worth fighting for. The closure of Duns Sheriff Court will force victims and witnesses to travel over 30 miles to Jedburgh Sheriff Court. Indeed, the Court Service has conceded that the closure will result in some of my constituents unable to travel to Jedburgh by public transport without an overnight stay. This clearly breaches the Court Service's own principles of provision of access to justice, and the closure of these courts will place a huge amount of stress on the courts that remain open and are forced to take thousands of additional cases. And as the motion today recognises, these closures will result in the withdrawal of high-quality civil service job opportunities in the Borders, which in rural areas like the Borders is a particular blow. Court closures Scotland-wide are yet further evidence of the SNP's increasingly urban prioritisation and centralisation tendency. They represent the diversion of more and more public services into the central belt and major cities, ignoring the importance of local services and local access to justice in areas such as the Borders. Alternatives to court closures exist, including moving courts on a part-time basis and the better use of existing public buildings. In my constituency, to add insult to injury, the closure of Duns will only make relatively minor savings, meaning an important local service will be lost for only a minimal gain to the court service's budget. Deputy Presiding Officer, I think it is noticeable and perhaps telling how few SNP members are in the chamber for this debate. None of the SNP regional members are present, and indeed only Christine Graham comes from a constituency in the south of Scotland. I am still unable to understand why Colin Keir, Sandra White, John Finney, Roderick Campbell and Christine Graham all voted in favour of closing a fifth of Scotland's Sheriff Courts, in light of the evidence we received in the committee that showed access to justice would be damaged. I'll give way to Mr Hume.
Thank you very much, Mr Lamont. You mentioned about Christine Graham and others voting to close it, but do you not think it was hypocritical that just a few weeks before that, in December 2012, Ms Graham stated in her Christmas message, "Have a good Christmas. In the new year, the fight goes on to keep Peebles Sheriff Court open."
John Lamont.
I thank the member for that point, and I do agree entirely. I mean, back in June, SNP members of the Justice Committee, including Christine Graham, apparently put party interests first and local people second. This is not a trend the SNP should be proud of, and I hope that will redeem themselves by opposing any further closures, but I doubt it. Presiding Officer, despite the withdrawal of justice from many towns in my constituency, the future of Jedburgh and Selkirk Sheriff Courts remain in doubt. The Court Service is currently assessing the most effective method for future provision of an integrated justice service for the Borders. This clearly means further closures are being actively considered, and the courts on the Borders may yet fall from 4 to just 1. I hope the court service will learn lessons from last year and properly consult and listen to the views of local residents who are telling me loud and clear that local justice matters and that local justice is important. The closure of Jedburgh and Selkirk Sheriff Courts would be a devastating blow for the borders and is a move that I will continue to speak out against. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call Dr Elaine Murray, after which we'll move to the closing speech of the Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too congratulate Jim Hume on having this motion selected for debate and thereby making sure that the decision taken by the Scottish Government and its majority in Parliament to close sheriff courts in rural South Scotland is not simply brushed aside and forgotten, as some might prefer. On 11th of June last year, the Justice Committee voted by a majority of only one not to annul the Sheriff Courts District Amendment Order and the Justice of the Peace Courts Amendment Order. Local members representing the affected communities put forward arguments on access to justice, on possible alternatives such as sharing facilities with other public sector agencies, on the wider effects of the closures on local communities, all of those to no avail. In relation to the closure of Annan JP Court and Kirkcudbright Sheriff Court, I pointed out to the committee the unanimous opposition of all members of all parties, including the SNP, on Dumfries and Galloway Council to the closures, and their fears of all members of that council that this could lead to the non-reporting of crime because of the distances required to travel to court, and also to the effects on staff in criminal justice social work and in the police. However, a programme of closure of 10 sheriff courts and 7 JP courts subsequently commenced. The historic courts in Annan, 700 years, as Jim Hume has said, and Kirkcudbright, which dated from 1455, both those courts closed last November. The case against the closure of those courts concentrated on the access to justice for victims and witnesses, as Jim Hume's motion states. But I think he also makes an important point about the precedent of removing civil service jobs from rural areas. Taken together with the loss of jobs from police and fire control rooms and police counters, we seem to be witnessing now the reverse of the relocations policy of the Scottish Executive during the first 8 years of this Parliament. Because under that executive, the Small Units Initiative relocated small discrete units of staff of around 10 to 15 people to rural areas to bring to those areas the benefits of public sector employment to rural communities. In contrast, the current government is removing units of staff, not even always small units of staff, from rural communities and relocating them in the Central Belt. The other irony is that since the Scottish Government pushed through its desire to close these rural courts, it has introduced legislation which will place additional pressures on the Sheriff Court system, a system which we all know is acknowledged to be under strain. If the requirement for the abolition of corroboration is passed, and heavens knows it's probably odds on that it will be, since Christine Graham is the only person who's had the guts to stick her head up over the parapet on that one, many cases will come to the Sheriff Courts which currently would not do. These will probably be unsuccessful, as we know, but they will add to the workload of the courts. The Courts Reform Bill, also undertaking its journey through Parliament this year, proposes playing executive competence for civil cases under 150,000 on the Sheriff Courts, removing some 2,700 cases from the Court of Session to the Sheriff Courts. Now, I know the Government will argue that the bill also proposes establishing a specialist personal injury court in Edinburgh. However, in rural locations such as in the south of Scotland, complainants might opt to have their case heard in a Sheriff Court closer to home. And although the introduction of summary sheriffs to deal with less complex cases may eventually allow specialist sheriffs more time to devote to their specialisms, these sheriffs are only to be appointed when an existing sheriff retires or leaves. And it may therefore take around 10 years, as we heard at Justice Committee, for the system to be fully established. So in the short to medium term, these reforms will add to the pressures currently on our sheriff courts. The closure of rural sheriff courts a few months before these bills came to Parliament does not really seem to be an example of joined-up thinking on the part of the Government. So I think Jim Hume was right in his motion to continue to highlight the Government's failure to look at the bigger picture, but also its failure to safeguard public sector employment in the south of Scotland and in Dumfries and Galloway.
Thanks so much. Now call on Minister Rosanna Cunningham to close the debate on behalf of the Government. 7 minutes or thereby. Minister, please.
Presiding Officer, I do welcome the opportunity to remind members that the proposals for rationalising the Sheriff Court structure are part of a wider set of reforms to create a modern justice system that better meets the needs of the people of Scotland, including those in the south of Scotland. The wider reforms, both civil and criminal, will ensure that cases are more effectively managed, reducing wasted time and the number of hearings required for each case. We can't do that unless the court estate is rationalised by taking business out of courts that are underused or which duplicate provision in an area. It's also important to remember that the volume of business carried out in the Sheriff Courts recommended for closure is only around 5% of the total business. Overall court business is down. Civil business in the Sheriff Courts is down 13% in 2011-12 compared with 2010-11, and as we know, crime is at a 37-year low. And the Scottish Court Service is confident that the transferred business can be moved without difficulty to a smaller number of better-equipped courts with modern facilities for victims, witnesses and jurors. The remaining courts will provide a more efficient structure for delivery of both general and specialist court services. And we've really not heard much about that in the debate. Today's debate does seem mostly to be about location, location, location. John Lamont, for example, referenced Duns Sheriff Court. But in 2011-12, there were only 45 sitting days at Duns. It doesn't meet equality standards, and there are no dedicated vulnerable witness facilities at that Sheriff Court.
Jim Hume.
Doesn't just cover Duns, it covers the whole of what we would call Berwickshire. If you're going from Eyemouth and to now Jedburgh and have to get there for 10 o'clock in the morning on public transport, that is near and in fact is impossible. Accessibility is disappearing. That's an equality issue.
Minister.
Actually thought about that and have said already that they will accommodate as much as they possibly can change of time to ensure that people can get to any court cases they're required to be at. And can I just say something about the situation we're in? Some members, and that includes Jim Hume himself, still don't appear to understand that actually it is the Scottish Court Service who makes decisions in relation to courts. They want us to overrule the Scottish Court Service, but then we would be accused of running everything from the centre. The Scottish Court Service makes the decision. The court closures were an operational matter for the Scottish Court Service, which is now an independent, judicially led corporate body. And that's the position following the enactment of the Judiciary and Courts Scotland Act 2008, which was passed unanimously by this Parliament. Now, ministers are satisfied that SCS has considered their options carefully against the principles of access to justice set out by the judiciary. They stipulated that court users should be able to get to court by public transport before their case proceeds and should be able to return home by public transport on the same day. And this may mean that some cases will be set for later in the court day, but SCS are confident that they will be able to satisfy that requirement. The fact is that maintaining old buildings which are unsuitable for the 21st century is too expensive. Christine Graham is absolutely right. It is unsustainable. And if opposition members believe we should keep paying that price, they do have to say what other services would be cut instead. There will be no redundancies among Scottish Court Service staff who will be redeployed to larger courts. In all cases, the resource, both judicial and SCS staff, will follow the business transferring. This is not a case of cutting capacity. Now, I can understand the concern about the future of the Sheriff Courts in Jedburgh and Selkirk and Duns. I do understand that. I'm a local member like everybody else, and particularly with the Selkirk link to Sir Walter Scott. But it's worth pointing out that not only is it 40 years since a Sheriff Court sat in Hawick, and it wasn't the SNP government that ended that, but also there has never been a Sheriff Court, for example, in Galashiels. There are many, many communities in Scotland where there aren't Sheriff Courts, communities that are way larger than those we're talking about in this debate. So travelling to a Sheriff Court is something which has been a feature of life, not just in the Borders for a long time, but for people across the length and breadth of Scotland. However, the numbers of people who do have to attend court are very small. Most of them do so very rarely, and it can be accommodated. Now, yet again, however, as I've said in previous debates, I have to say that some of the contributions lead inexorably to a solution mandating a Sheriff Court in almost every community. We've never had that, never in our history. And while members are long on criticism, they're very short on any solutions that they would bring forward to the difficulties that we currently confront with an outdated badly resourced, over many decades service, something that this government has inherited and has to do something about. Now, the study group referred to by a number of members, including Jim Hume, is jointly sponsored by SCS and Scottish Borders Council and is considering the possibility of a justice centre in the Borders, an assessment of the most efficient, effective and economic method for the future provision of an integrated justice service for the Scottish Borders. It is a feasibility study, it's not a blueprint for delivery. There is no settled position on one or other type of model, despite the pessimism of some here. The study group is working through phases of analysis and engagement with a wide range of organisations, and the next steps will be for it to complete its analysis and reach conclusions on feasibility. And the final stage will be a report to the SCS Board and Scottish Borders Council Leaders Group. And that report is expected to be available and published in June 2014. We're not dodging issues here. We're trying to work through them. As I said earlier, many of Scotland's courts date from Victorian times and are not fit for purpose in the 21st century, and many are underused. Others lie close to bigger courts where business will be scheduled more efficiently in terms of court and shrivel time. Ministers do believe that the recommendations of the Scottish Court Service for the future shape of Scotland's courts will better meet the needs of the people of Scotland, and that's what it's aiming to do.
Many thanks. And I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30.